Hey everyone, two PowerPoints this week about legacies of the Vietnam War. And in this first one, I'm going to talk about Bill Clinton, Robert McNamara, and then very briefly the presidential election of 2000, in which a Vietnam veteran, Senator John McCain, ran for the presidency. Going to spend more time on Robert McNamara and the controversy that surrounded the publication of his memoir in 1995, but let's jump into this. Bill Clinton is an important transitional president. I always emphasize this about Clinton when I teach about him in my 20th century class. The reason I say that is because he's the first baby boomer president, so his reference points are completely different in terms of what he was exposed to growing up, completely different from his predecessors, most of whom were impacted by World War II. So, and you can remember that Clinton's predecessor and the person he defeated in the presidential election of 1992 was George H.W. Bush, who was a World War II veteran and a carrier pilot. So, Clinton's reference points are things like television, the emergence of rock and roll, the civil rights movement, and the Vietnam War. Critics of Clinton characterized him as a draft dodger. Clinton received 5 student deferments, which was way above the norm and actually above what was allowed. So it's clear he received favorable treatment from authorities in Arkansas. Part of this, I think, was because Clinton was such a gifted student and was a Rhodes Scholar as a college student. There aren't many Rhodes Scholars who have come out of Arkansas. But he's not the only one to get favorable treatment from that era. Secretary of Defense and later Vice President Dick Cheney had 5 deferments too. One of the things that is evident when subject of the Vietnam War comes up, and this is something I'm going to return to in the second PowerPoint when I talk about the 2004 election between John Kerry and George W. Bush, is that Democrats, liberals, always have faced more scrutiny about what they did during the Vietnam War era than conservatives. We've seen this with Donald Trump and his bone spurs. That was hardly talked about. I mean, people have used it as a source of mockery for Trump. For those of you that don't know, that's why, Donald Trump was of age where he could have served in Vietnam, and a doctor categorized him as medically unfit for the draft because of bone spurs. And so you hear this come up periodically, but it really wasn't made an issue. Doesn't work that way for Democrats and liberals. Clinton was subjected to all sorts of questions a candidate hadn't faced when he first ran in 92. Did you use drugs, and if so, what kind? Did you demonstrate against the Vietnam War? Why didn't you fight in Vietnam? Could you have been drafted? All this sort of stuff. So I think this is an example with Clinton's presidency of kind of the shadow of the Vietnam War for the first time influencing and playing a role in a presidential election, mostly in the first election of 1992 when Clinton first ran for the presidency. He runs again successfully in 1996 and defeats Republican opponent Senator Robert Dole of Kansas, who was a World War II veteran, and that is the last World War II veteran to run for the presidency. So Vietnam War comes up during Clinton's presidency, in part because of him being the first president or first candidate for the presidency to have lived through the Vietnam era and to have been old enough potentially to have served. So now we're going to turn to what happens just a few years later. So Clinton's elected, the 1992 presidential election, comes into office in January of 1993. 2 years later, former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara publishes a memoir that he intends to be something of an apology for the Vietnam War, and instead it was like an explosion going off in the literary world and for Vietnam veterans, generated a tremendous amount of controversy. We know now that McNamara was suffering from stress, anxiety, depression during the final year to year and a half that he was Secretary of Defense, primarily in 1967 and then into early 68, which is when he officially leaves. You can see on the slide, this is an account from a book about McNamara, about a kind of breakdown he had in front of his staff at one of his last meetings as Secretary of Defense in February of 1968, where he begins crying and launches into this profanity-laced tirade about the war in Vietnam, denouncing the Air Force, denouncing General Westmoreland, characterizing the war as completely out of control. McNamara never expressed these views in public. Shortly after this, he resigns as Secretary of Defense, transitions to a very lucrative position as president of the World Bank, and doesn't say anything about the war for years. And this is part of what primes the fuse for the explosion that happens when McNamara's book comes out in 1995. So here you see McNamara's book in retrospect, which, as I said, I think McNamara intended as kind of a peacemaking gesture, coming to terms with the Vietnam War. The problem is that he continued to engage in the same sort of stuff that he had done before, with half-truths and making statements that were just false. Whether he believed these or if he had convinced himself over years to believe them because he had been saying this stuff so long, I just can't say for sure as an historian. But one of the elements of our module this week, you're going to be reading a little bit more about this book, and you'll read a response from two former State Department analysts, both of whom wrote op-ed pieces in prominent newspapers criticizing McNamara and rejecting completely this argument that he made in the book, where he says, well, part of the reason that I made the decisions I did and the recommendations I did to President Kennedy and President Johnson is because that's the advice I was being given. You should remember from the beginning of this class, that's not right. Very early, people like Paul Kattenberg, other people from the State Department were recommending against the United States deepening its involvement in the Vietnam War. The other thing that angered people about this is because elements of McNamara's book seem to act like the Pentagon Papers didn't exist, and the release of the Pentagon Papers had brought to public attention memos like this one that McNamara wrote in late November 1965. This is after he's made recommendations to increase the levels of American forces, increase the number of troops in Vietnam. But here in late November, composing this memo to President Johnson, where he says, well, it seems like we've got two options here. One is a compromise and not introduce any more troops. And by this point, the number of Americans in Vietnam was already 150,000. Then he says the other objective, or the other option, is to stick with our stated objectives, stick with the war, provide what it takes in men and material, and if we choose that option, we're going to need to deploy 400,000 troops within a year and have 600,000 troops within 2 years. But he adds that these might not guarantee success. And even, McNamara loves statistics, makes these projections that casualties could reach 1,000 a month, and the odds are that within 2 years, we're going to be in the same situation as we are now with nothing improved. This is absolutely incredible that McNamara wrote this. So at this point, he's already decided that the war isn't winnable, but doesn't communicate that and continues to watch young men go to Vietnam, fight and die over the next slightly over 2 years that he's Secretary of Defense. So I think the fact that McNamara's attempt at an apology fell flat. The fact that he's repeating things that people knew weren't true. The fact that McNamara, I think, out of everybody connected with the Vietnam War, he's clearly the most hated figure. Veterans have expressed this repeatedly when McNamara was alive. And I think a lot of it goes back to his decisions to use quantification, statistics to measure success in the war, coming up with the body count, kill ratio, all these sorts of things, leaving his position as Secretary of Defense after he had decided 2 years before that the war wasn't winnable, and not saying anything about it for years and years until coming out with this book. McNamara was blasted by veterans. This is just one example of a lot of stuff you can find even online today. An editorial from the New York Times, highly critical of McNamara and the message that he put out in this book. This is a book I recommend if you want to delve into this. A writer named Paul Hendrickson wrote this book, The Living and the Dead, Robert McNamara and 5 Lives of a Lost War. It's a very unusual book structurally in that it's kind of a biography of McNamara, but Hendrickson weaves that together with the stories of 5 different people impacted by the Vietnam War, including Norman Morrison, the Quaker protester, anti-war demonstrator, and activist who set himself on fire outside the Pentagon in view of McNamara's office. And it even begins with an anecdote about an artist who had been an opponent of the war who saw McNamara on a ferry boat headed for a weekend vacation off Martha's Vineyard, and this is in 1972. And this guy was so angry at seeing McNamara leaning against the bar in his sporty clothes, laughing with friends, that this guy who was just a local resident and artist approaches McNamara and pretends to be a member of the crew, tells him he has a phone call and would he come to the bridge of the ferry boat to take the call. And McNamara follows this guy out on the deck, and the guy tries to throw him overboard. It's kind of a horrifying incident. McNamara managed to hang on to the railing, and other people came to his assistance. And McNamara decided not to press charges about this incident. But the book starts with a bang, with the person who attempted to do that speaking with Paul Hendrickson. It's a very interesting, worthwhile book. And then lastly, the presidential election of 2000. I mentioned this really quickly here at the end because this is the first time we had a Vietnam veteran actually attempting to attain the presidential nomination, and that was Senator John McCain, who early on was the leader in polls and primaries for the Republican Party. Ultimately, he's defeated by George W. Bush. And we're going to come back to Bush and what he did during the Vietnam War in the next PowerPoint. But I think if McCain had been the Republican nominee, it would have been interesting to see if the Vietnam War became a greater subject of conversation in the campaign itself. Maybe not. As it was, the 2000 election, once Bush becomes candidate, Vietnam wasn't talked about at all because polls showed Bush neck and neck with the Democratic candidate Al Gore, and the election of 2000 ends up being one of the craziest disputed elections in American history, with Bush losing the popular vote but winning the electoral vote because he carries the state of Florida, and recounting there was halted pretty much by a Supreme Court decision. So Bush comes into office amidst a swirl of controversy. But once McCain is out of the race, doesn't get the Republican nomination, Vietnam pretty quickly disappears as a topic in that election.